Imagine this. You're one of the most wanted men on the planet. Every law enforcement agency in the world is looking for you. The US government has put a bounty on your head. And what do you do with your free time? You build a zoo. Not just any zoo, a private, fully custom-designed zoo with tigers, lions, bears, crocodiles, panthers, and deer on a ranch so massive that the only way to see all the animals is to hop on a train and ride through it. And then you invite your friends over like it's nothing. That's exactly what Joaquin El Chapo Guzman did. And that's not even the craziest part of this story. Because his sons, the people who inherited this empire, they allegedly took it one step further. They didn't just keep the animals. They allegedly used them on people. Today we're going inside El Chapo's exotic zoo, how it was built, what was in it, who visited it, and what happened to that animal obsession after El Chapo was locked away forever. Now, before we dive in, if you're unaware of who El Chapo actually is, like beyond just the name, let me quickly set the scene, because this is important context for everything we're about to talk about. Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera, known as El Chapo, which literally translates to Shorty in Spanish, was the head of the Sinaloa cartel, which at its peak was the largest and most powerful drug trafficking organization in the entire world. Not just Mexico, the world. The US government estimated that his cartel controlled somewhere between 40 and 60% of all drugs entering the United States. That's not a small operation. That is basically a multinational corporation, except the product is cocaine, heroin, meth, and marijuana, and the competitors get killed. And the money that came from that? Prosecutors estimated El Chapo personally accumulated around $14 billion over his career. $14 billion. Now, when people have that kind of money, especially in that world, they spend it in very specific ways. Weapons, properties, bribes, and for El Chapo, exotic animals. A lot of them. For this video, when I talk about his zoo, I'm specifically referring to the private animal compound he built on one of his ranches in Guadalajara, Mexico, during the height of his power in the late 1980s through the 1990s. But as you'll see, the animal obsession connected to El Chapo goes way deeper than just one ranch. So here's how this video is going to go. We're going to start with the zoo itself, what was in it, how it was built, and how it was revealed to the entire world. Then we're going to get into the psychology behind why drug lords build these things, because it's actually really fascinating and goes back centuries. Then we're going to talk about some of the wildest surrounding facts, including El Chapo's sons, the animals being used as weapons, and how an architect who designed escape tunnels also designed this zoo. And then we're going to talk about what happened after El Chapo's world collapsed. What happened to the animals? What happened to the empire? And whether any of this is still going on today. There's a lot here, so let's get into it. Let me start with some quick background because I think it actually makes the zoo story hit different when you understand where this man came from. El Chapo was born on April 4th, 1957, in a tiny remote village called La Tuna, in the mountains of Sinaloa, Mexico. And when I say remote, I mean remote. This is one of those places where the roads barely exist, the government is basically absent, and the economy, for a lot of families, revolves around one thing: growing drugs, specifically opium and marijuana. His family was poor, like genuinely struggling. He didn't have a real formal education. And by his own account, the reason he got into drug trafficking wasn't some grand ambition, it was survival. He started working in the drug trade as a teenager, moving shipments for bigger players in the region. Now here's the thing about El Chapo that made him different from everyone else around him. He was smart, like genuinely strategically intelligent. He wasn't just a muscle guy. He understood logistics, he understood money, he understood how to build relationships, and he understood how to scale an operation. He rose through the ranks of the Guadalajara cartel in the 1980s, working under the legendary Felix Gallardo, one of the original Mexican drug lords. And when Felix Gallardo was arrested in 1989 and the whole cartel split up, El Chapo grabbed his piece of the pie and ran with it. By the early 1990s, his former cartel lieutenant Miguel Angel Martinez would later testify in court. And I'm going to come back to this testimony a lot because it's basically the primary source for everything we know about the zoo, that the cocaine business in that era was, quote, the best thing in the world. The money was coming in so fast and in such ridiculous quantities that Martinez described stuffing $8 to $10 million in cash onto private jets almost every single month just to move money from the US border back to Mexico. When you're talking about that level of cash flow, the question stops being, can I afford this? And starts being, what is even worth spending money on? And that's when the excess begins. According to Martinez's testimony, El Chapo had 4 private jets, a ranch in every single state in Mexico, beach houses along every major coastline, a $10 million mansion in Acapulco, and a yacht he named Chapito, which is honestly just hilarious to me. The man named his yacht after himself. And then there was the zoo. So let's talk about the zoo specifically, because I think people hear narco zoo and they picture like some dude with a tiger on a chain in his backyard. What El Chapo had was something completely different. His main compound in Guadalajara was already wild on its own. We're talking about a sprawling ranch property with swimming pools, tennis courts, and a full luxury residence. That alone would be extraordinary, but then he went and built an entire zoological exhibit on the property, a proper designed private zoo. And this is where it gets insane. The zoo wasn't just a collection of cages. It was specifically set up so that visitors, his guests, could board a small train and ride through the grounds to view the animals up close. That is not an exaggeration. A literal train. On a private ranch, owned by one of the world's most wanted drug lords. Now, the animals that were confirmed inside this zoo through court testimony from multiple witnesses included tigers, lions, panthers, deer, crocodiles, and bears. And that's just what was confirmed. When you look at other narco zoos that were raided around Mexico during the same era, you start to see that the confirmed animals are usually just the beginning. Drug cartel zoos in Mexico have been found to include giraffes, buffaloes, camels, ostriches, peacocks, and monkeys. The list gets genuinely insane. But here's the detail that I think most people skip over, and it's one of the most interesting parts of this whole story. El Chapo didn't just build the zoo himself. He commissioned an actual professional architect to design it. His name was Felipe de Jesus Corona Verbera. And this architect had a very specific talent that El Chapo also used for other purposes. He was exceptional at designing tunnels. This is the same architect who designed one of El Chapo's famous escape tunnels that ran from a residence all the way to a cartel-owned warehouse across the border in Arizona. By all accounts, El Chapo was genuinely delighted by the tunnel. There are reports of him exclaiming something along the lines of Corona made an incredible tunnel. That's his response to a secret underground border crossing. So you have this architect who's building escape routes under international borders, and El Chapo also has him design a zoo for tigers and crocodiles on a ranch in Guadalajara. The range on this guy's portfolio is something else. And the fact that an architect was involved tells you something important. This wasn't impulsive, this was planned. El Chapo didn't wake up one day and go, yeah, let me throw some animals on the property. This was a deliberate, designed, structured thing that he invested serious time and money into building. It was meant to be impressive. It was meant to make a statement. Now here's something that a lot of people don't realize. The general public really didn't know the full details of El Chapo's zoo until his federal drug conspiracy trial in Brooklyn, New York, which ran from late 2018 into early 2019. This trial was genuinely one of the most wild and unprecedented criminal proceedings in American history. Like, the stories that came out of that courtroom on a daily basis were so insane that legal analysts were going on TV saying it was rivaling the O.J. Simpson trial in terms of sheer unbelievable drama. One CBS News legal analyst literally said that if there had been cameras inside that courtroom, it would have riveted the entire nation. The primary witness who talked about the zoo was Miguel Angel Martinez, his former cartel lieutenant who went by the nickname El Gordo, meaning the fat one. Martinez had worked for El Chapo from 1986 until his arrest in 1998. He started as a pilot, then became the liaison between the Sinaloa cartel and the Colombian cocaine suppliers, and eventually ran a Mexico City office coordinating drug shipments worth tens of millions of dollars every single month. He knew El Chapo personally. They traveled the world together. He was the godfather to El Chapo's son. So when Martinez took the stand and started describing what life was like inside El Chapo's world, the jury was hearing it from someone who had a front row seat for all of it. And the zoo came up almost casually, like it was just another item on the list. 4 private jets? Yes. A beach house on every major Mexican coastline? Yes. A $10 million Acapulco mansion? Yes. A zoo with tigers, lions, panthers, deer, and crocodiles that guests could tour by riding a small train? Yes, that too. Martinez also confirmed that El Chapo personally enjoyed world travel. Brazil, Argentina, Aruba, Europe, Japan, Hong Kong, Thailand, Peru, Cuba, Colombia, and more. He went to Macau to gamble. He went to Switzerland for anti-aging cellular rejuvenation treatments, which honestly is not what I expected. He gifted his employees diamond-encrusted Rolex watches. He bought 50 luxury cars one Christmas, Thunderbirds, Cougars, Buicks, worth about $30,000 to $35,000 each, just to give away to cartel workers as gifts. He paid musicians hundreds of thousands of dollars to write custom narco corridos, which are ballads specifically about his dead friends. The zoo was revealed to the world as part of all this. Just one piece of a genuinely extraordinary picture of what $14 billion in drug money actually looks like when one person spends it. This is a question I've seen a lot of people ask, and it's a really good one. Who was actually going to this zoo? Was it open to anyone? Was it a secret? What was the deal? From what we know, the zoo was not open to the general public. This wasn't something where people in Guadalajara could just roll up on a weekend and ride the train to see the tigers. This was a private property belonging to one of the most wanted men in Mexico. Security was obviously paramount. The visitors to the zoo were people within El Chapo's inner circle, trusted cartel associates, business partners, allies, family members. The people who were already inside the compound, inside his world, were the ones who got the experience of riding that little train through the animal exhibits. And this is actually a really important detail because it tells you why the zoo existed. It wasn't just vanity, it was a tool. When you're running a criminal organization of that scale, loyalty and relationships are literally everything. The people you trust with your life, the people who are managing your money and your shipments and your communications, you need to keep them close. You need them to feel like they're part of something special. You need them to feel the power. And what better way to communicate power than to show someone a lion you own? To put them on a train and take them past a crocodile on your property? It's a message. It says, I have so much money and so much control that I built this, and you're here because I invited you. It's honestly not that different from how kings and emperors throughout history used exotic animals, menageries they were called, as demonstrations of their dominance and reach. The animal said, I have the wealth and the connections to bring the entire world to my doorstep. And that's not a coincidence. Okay, so this is the part of the story that I find genuinely fascinating because there's actually a really interesting historical and psychological reason why drug lords, specifically, are drawn to exotic animals. A professor at the University of Texas named Howard Campbell, who studies the gangster lifestyle, made this point really clearly. He said that for Mexican drug lords, the cultural role models weren't other criminals. They were the old hacienda owners from colonial times, the lords of massive estates, the kind of people who had everything and answered to no one. That fantasy of being the lord of the manor runs incredibly deep in the culture, and drug money gives people the means to actually live it. Campbell specifically said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that most of these cartel bosses came from rural backgrounds where animals were already part of their world growing up. The difference is that now they have billions of dollars to upgrade from farm animals to tigers. And then there's the predator psychology angle, which is honestly kind of wild when you think about it. An expert from Global Animal magazine put it really bluntly. The traffickers see themselves as the top predators in their food chain, and they want to have other top predators in their zoos. Think about that for a second. The tiger isn't just a pet. The tiger is a mirror. It's a symbol of exactly what they believe they are. The World Wildlife Fund's Adrian Reuter, who works specifically on the animal trade in Mexico, described the appeal by saying that drug lords prefer charismatic animals that symbolize power and strength. Big cats like lions, tigers, and jaguars, along with big snakes, monkeys, and impressive birds. Notice the word choices: power, strength, charismatic. It's not about cuddly animals. It's specifically about animals that communicate dominance. And then you layer on top of that the influence of pop culture. In 1983, the film Scarface came out. Al Pacino's character, a cocaine kingpin, keeps a white tiger on his estate. That image was seared into the cultural imagination of an entire generation of drug traffickers. By the time the Colombian cocaine boom was in full swing in the late 1980s, Pablo Escobar was already building his legendary private zoo at Hacienda Napoles, complete with hippos, giraffes, zebras, lions, cheetahs, ostriches, and more. And the Mexican cartel leaders, who were watching and learning from the Colombians as they took over the cocaine trade, picked up the habit. El Chapo was building his zoo at exactly the right time, in exactly the right era, to be influenced by all of this. And then, his sons would take it and put it all over social media. This is where the story takes a really serious turn, so stay with me here. El Chapo has multiple sons, and the ones most relevant to this story are known collectively as Los Chapitos, which literally means the little Chapos. These four sons, Ivan, Alfredo, Joaquin, and Ovidio, took over significant portions of the Sinaloa cartel after their father was eventually extradited to the United States in 2017. And like their father, they had a very obvious thing for exotic animals. But unlike their father, who kept his zoo relatively private, the sons were on social media posting about it constantly. Alfredo Guzman specifically maintained what was believed to be his personal Twitter account, and he posted dozens of photos of pet lions, tigers, and cheetahs. And here's the detail that just gets me. The large cats were often photographed inside his luxury sports cars, like he's driving a Lamborghini, and there's a tiger chilling in the passenger seat, just casually, like that's normal. U.S. federal agents who were working the case against El Chapo's sons actually referenced these posts after the fact. A DEA agent said, and this is a direct quote, "We figured if we got El Chapo out of Mexico, those kids would show their colors. They were on social media with the Ferraris and tigers. We called them the goofy narco juniors," which is pretty hilarious, but also they weren't wrong. The sons were posting everything: wads of cash, gold-plated assault rifles, luxury cars, private airplanes on makeshift landing strips in the middle of nowhere, and tigers. Always the tigers, Now here is where it gets really dark, and I want to be clear about this because this is serious. The Sons were eventually charged by the U.S. Justice Department with a list of crimes that goes way beyond drug trafficking. And among the accusations, which you can read in federal court documents, was that they tortured enemies by electrocuting them, waterboarding them, and feeding them alive to tigers. Let me say that again. The Department of Justice accused El Chapo's sons of feeding living human beings to tigers that they kept on their ranches. I want to be clear that these are allegations in federal charges, not confirmed convictions on those specific counts, as of the time I'm making this video. But the fact that the United States Justice Department put this in official documents is something I genuinely don't have a word for. It's a level of horror that's hard to process. And when you go back and look at what experts were already saying about brutal Mexican cartels around 2011, they were being reported on in local Mexican media as having fed rivals to their captive big cats. An expert said at the time, "It does not surprise me that traffickers are feeding their competitors to animals in private zoos." So what started with El Chapo as an expression of wealth, power, and status, a zoo you take a train through with your friends, evolved in his son's hands into something that law enforcement described as among the most violent and dangerous criminal enterprises on the planet. The apple, in this case, fell very close to the tree, and then the tree got a lot darker. Now, El Chapo Zoo was famous, but it was far from the only one. And if you want to understand how deep this thing goes, you need to zoom out a little. When Mexican security forces started cracking down on cartel leaders in the mid-2000s through the 2010s, they kept finding the same thing on these narco ranches: animals. Lots and lots of animals. One of the most staggering examples involved Jesus El Rey Zambada, the brother of El Chapo's own partner, Ismael El Mayo Zambada. When security forces arrested El Rey in October 2008, they found over 200 animals on his 16-acre luxury ranch. 200 animals, including monkeys, peacocks, ostriches, and more, in addition to the usual big cats. The ranch itself had elaborate gardens, stables full of purebred horses, and facilities that one Mexican zoo official described as honestly pretty impressive. They also found AK-47s, Beretta pistols, and cocaine on the property. Just to keep things in perspective. And El Rey's ranch isn't even the wildest version of this. Mexican zoo authorities and wildlife officials started reporting that cartel compounds had been found containing not just big cats, but giraffes, buffaloes, and camels. One official said he'd heard of cartel zoos that were genuinely comparable to mid-size public zoological facilities. The problem that followed all of this was actually a real logistical nightmare for the Mexican government. Every time they busted a cartel leader, they now had to figure out what to do with the animals. Mexico's public zoos were getting overwhelmed. Officials from the World Wildlife Fund in Mexico specifically flagged this. Even the zoos have limits, one representative said. They don't have infinite space. They have health and safety regulations to comply with. And some of these animals are species that aren't native to Mexico and literally cannot be released into the wild. At one point, the situation got so extreme that Mexico's Navy, the actual Navy, got involved in an operation to transport 11 big cats and a coyote to the Wild Animal Sanctuary in Denver, Colorado. The Mexican government called it the Journey to Freedom. It was the largest such operation in Latin American history. And it happened because drug lord zoos had created such a surplus of displaced exotic animals that they had to call in the military to manage the logistics. That's where we are with this. That's how normalized and widespread the narco zoo phenomenon became. Here's something that I think a lot of people miss when they talk about narco zoos, and it actually changes the picture in an important way. The animals in these compounds weren't just pets. They were also business. By the 2000s and into the 2010s, Mexican cartels had started to recognize something. The illegal wildlife trade is one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in the world, and it's almost completely overlooked by law enforcement compared to drugs and weapons. Interpol estimated the global illegal trade in live species and animal parts was worth up to $20 billion a year. That's a massive market. And crucially, the penalties for wildlife trafficking are dramatically lower than for drug trafficking. One expert in the wildlife trade said, you can sometimes make as much profit, if not more, than drug smuggling with less consequences. Because law enforcement is not paying attention, and if you are caught, the penalty is just a slap on the wrist. So cartels, who already had established smuggling routes, warehouses, border connections, corrupt officials, and transportation networks, they started adding animals to the pipeline. They shared their infrastructure with wildlife traffickers, and some went even further into the business themselves. The methods got creative and disturbing. Traffickers stuffed condoms full of cocaine inside live animals. They packed tiny birds like hummingbirds into empty cigarette packs. Baby monkeys were crammed into car air conditioning ducts and driven across the border. One wildlife expert described finding 4 hummingbirds bound and stuffed into a cigarette pack. He said for every 10 that are trafficked, only 1 survives. In Mexico, exotic animals had also become so normalized that you could buy them relatively openly. A tiger cub in Mexico could go for as little as a couple $1,000s at certain points. Lion and tiger cubs from breeding centers were being sold for around $4,000 to $7,000. Baby crocodiles, species native to Mexico, were being sold for $200 out of pet stores in Guadalajara, the same city where El Chapo built his zoo. El Chapo's zoo existed within this broader context. It was a product of a world where exotic animals were power, status, money, and fear, all wrapped into one. I want to come back to something I mentioned earlier because I think it deserves its own moment, the role that pop culture played in creating the narco zoo phenomenon. In 1983, Scarface comes out. Tony Montana, Al Pacino's fictional Cuban cocaine kingpin, lives in a Miami mansion with a white tiger in the yard. That image hits different when you understand the timing. This was right at the beginning of the real-life cocaine boom in the Americas. Pablo Escobar was building his empire in Colombia. The Guadalajara cartel was rising in Mexico. A generation of drug traffickers who were actively modeling their lives on wealth and power got handed a very specific visual template. This is what success looks like. This is the aesthetic. Pablo Escobar went even bigger than Tony Montana. His private zoo at Hacienda Napolis had hippos, giraffes, zebras, llamas, cheetahs, lions, tigers, kangaroos, dolphins, in artificial lakes, and elephants. He built an African safari in Colombia. And then he opened it to the public, not just to his inner circle. Regular Colombian citizens could come visit Escobar's zoo. He was using it for public relations, trying to build a reputation as a man of the people, even while running a cartel responsible for thousands of deaths. When Escobar was killed in 1993, the government tried to relocate the animals. Most went to Colombian zoos, but the hippos, deemed too dangerous to approach, were left behind. And those hippos went into the Magdalena River, found no natural predators, found year-round water and food, and started breeding. By 2026, their descendants number somewhere around 200 hippos freely roaming the Colombian countryside. There are now more hippos in Colombia than in some African nations. They're considered the largest invasive species on Earth. And it all started because a drug lord thought a hippo would look cool on his estate. El Chapo was building his zoo in the exact same era that Escobar was running his. The influence was direct and acknowledged. Experts who study the cartel lifestyle specifically say the Mexicans copied some of that style, but they have always had some of their own style too. And what's El Chapo's own style? The architect-designed compound. the mini train experience, the curated guest list of cartel insiders who got to ride through and marvel at the collection. It was theatrical. It was designed to impress. It was Escobar's grandiosity filtered through El Chapo's more secretive, more paranoid, more controlled personality. El Chapo was arrested for the final time in January 2016 in a raid in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, after an extraordinary manhunt that involved, among other things, El Chapo meeting with actor Sean Penn for a Rolling Stone interview, which honestly is a whole separate video. He was extradited to the United States in January 2017, stood trial in Brooklyn beginning in late 2018, was convicted on all 17 counts of drug trafficking, conspiracy, and money laundering, and in July 2019 was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. He is currently serving that sentence at ADX Florence in Colorado, the United States' most secure Supermax facility. His properties were seized. His assets were stripped. The ranches, the beach houses, the jets, the yacht named Chapito, all of it. And the zoo on his Guadalajara ranch? There's no detailed public record of exactly what happened to the animals specifically. Unlike Escobar's hippos, which became an international news story in themselves, El Chapo's animals didn't generate the same kind of follow-up coverage. What we do know, based on how every other narco zoo seizure in Mexico went, is that the animals were likely transferred to Mexican environmental authorities and then dispersed to zoos and wildlife rescue centers around the country. What did survive was the culture. And arguably, what survived was even bigger than the zoo itself. His sons, Los Chapitos, took over and expanded the Sinaloa cartel. They shifted its focus heavily toward fentanyl, and in doing so, made it arguably more dangerous than it had ever been under their father. The US government has called the Chapitos operation the largest, most violent, and most prolific fentanyl trafficking enterprise in the world. The DEA has said that the Chapitos are responsible for a significant portion of the fentanyl deaths happening in the United States right now. And yes, they still had the tigers. So what do we actually take away from all of this? I think the narco zoo story is interesting because it's one of those things where on the surface it seems almost absurd. A drug lord with a private zoo you take a train through? It sounds like a movie. It sounds like something someone made up. But it's completely real. It's documented in federal court records, and it reveals something genuinely important about how power works in that world. The animals were never really about the animals. They were about what the animals communicated: power, control, wealth beyond imagination, the ability to bend the natural order to your will, to bring a tiger from another continent and make it live on your ranch in Mexico because you feel like it and nobody can stop you. And that's really what El Chapo's entire life was about, wasn't it? From a kid in the mountains of Sinaloa with nothing to eat, to the most powerful drug lord on earth, to a man who commissioned an architect to build him a private zoo with a train. He spent his whole life proving that he could take anything he wanted and nobody could stop him. The zoo was just the most literal possible expression of that. And then one day, the law caught up. The properties were seized, the animals were scattered, and El Chapo ended up in a 7 by 12-foot cell in Colorado with no windows to the outside world. The tigers are still out there somewhere. El Chapo is not. Okay, so that was El Chapo's narco zoo. The full story. From the architect who designed it to the sons who allegedly used the animals in ways I still can't fully wrap my head around. Honestly, every time I research something connected to El Chapo, I find another layer that's somehow more unbelievable than the last one. The zoo is one of those things where the more you dig, the wilder it gets. The Scarface influence, the Escobar comparison, the architect who built tunnels and tiger enclosures, the sons on Twitter with cheetahs in Lamborghinis. It's just a completely insane story. If you guys want me to do a deeper dive into any specific part of this, whether that's El Chapo's trial, Los Chapitos, and the fentanyl empire, or maybe a full video on narco wildlife trafficking, let me know in the comments. I genuinely enjoy making any of those. As always, if you enjoyed this, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you probably realize. Subscribe if you're new, and thank you guys for watching. This has been Your Name, and I'll see you guys next time.